I'm Earl Ellis. I'm an associate professor of geography and environmental systems at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and I'm a researcher who studies landscape ecology. So we are at the Haus der Kultur der Welt in Berlin at the Anthropocene campus, and I'm here because I've been part of this process here at the HKW since the beginning of the Anthropocene project. And I'm very interested in how this scientific concept of the Anthropocene has grown into a public community concept and where that is going. So here at the Haus der Kultur der Welt, we have a seminar called Anthropogenic Landscapes. And so my research involves how humans transform the ecology of landscapes. And so I bring to this idea of anthropogenic landscapes the idea that humans transform the ecology of landscapes. So I'm working together with two other professors, one who's a designer and architect, and the other is an anthropologist. And so we bring very, I would say completely different ideas of what a landscape is and how we should understand a landscape to this group of participants, with the idea that by engaging them with this idea of landscape and change and ecology in the Anthropocene, by going to a site in the real world, we can learn something about how we think about landscape and ecology and change in the Anthropocene. So, first of all, you can study ecosystems without the concept of landscape. And essentially when you do this, you're treating the ecosystem as a spatially homogeneous system, that the patterns in space do not matter. When I come to this ecosystem with landscape ecology, I want to understand how spatial pattern and process change the way an ecosystem functions. So if you need to consider spatial pattern and process, or variation in spatial pattern and process in understanding the ecosystem, then you need landscape, and then you need landscape ecology. But if you can study it just in place, you don't need landscape ecology. But if you want to get specific about what's the difference, let's say we want to create two different ideas, landscape and ecosystem, as two different ideas. Okay, the ecosystem is just the system of interactions of organisms with each other and the environment. And the landscape is any space that is heterogeneous. That's the only definition. It doesn't have to even be ecology, although as an ecologist, that's what I'm going to look at. I'm going to look at variables that are of ecological interest, say primary productivity or a habitat of some species, as it varies in space. So I started my career looking at the ecology of sustainable agriculture, and I became interested in understanding how Chinese farmers had managed to keep their agriculture productive for so long from an ecological point of view. And this led me to look more at how the landscape has changed, because I learned that farmers used the whole landscape to keep agriculture productive. They were moving materials around in order to maintain the productivity of the landscape. So from there, I got interested in both the change of landscapes and the fact that these small-scale changes made in very small fields, done hundreds of millions of times, becomes a global change. And so I got interested in global changes caused by landscape change. And very quickly it became obvious that when this Anthropocene concept came around, that my work connected with this perfectly. So I became interested in connecting local landscape change and global landscape change into understanding how humans are transforming the planet. So from my point of view, I'm interested in how human use of land transforms ecology. And at the scale at which people do that, it's largely a local process. So people are changing the landscape often a little bit at a time. But when you look at it at a global scale, you can see that it is changing the planet, right? The carbon in the atmosphere is not just from fossil fuel, it's also from people changing the way they use land. And so in order to study such a process, at the one hand, you need direct local understanding of what people are actually doing on the ground and why. You can't understand that from space. You can't see the reasons why people change land from space. On the other hand, if you want to connect this local process to global estimates, global understanding, you need a global framework. And so you need to be able to look at the global patterns of land use, also at the global scale. And then the key is to bring these two things together in the middle, where you can connect local understanding and scale it to global understanding using mostly statistical procedures based on the relationship between the local and the global. Well, like I said, I think from a scientific methodological point of view, we have a way of coupling local observation with global observation to come up with a linkage between what's going on locally and the global pattern to estimate globally what's going on locally. But from the point of view of trying to use that to inform decisions about local things that have global impacts, I'm not convinced that there's any direct connection between the statistical and the decisive, because essentially it's all coming down to these other players like states and interests that are not really local or global. So I think that although scientifically we can look at these two things, I think that states don't see this. They don't see either the truly local or the truly global. They're somewhere in between. So I'm not convinced that the way that I've managed to collect local and global will have much bearing on that kind of process. Well, like I said, when people are changing the land locally, if it's done and repeated across the world, then you have global change. And so to look at what I consider to be, and I think if you look at the changes that have been made so far by humans on the earth, the big change is agriculture. That's the biggest global change that we've had on the earth. We are busy making global climate change the biggest change, but it hasn't happened yet. We are in the process of making that happen, and I hope it doesn't happen. But to this date, the biggest change we've made so far is by changing the land, by removing forests and tilling the soil across the world, building cities. All this direct interaction with ecosystems, we've caused the greatest global change that we have so far. So I consider the study of global change in ecology with a deep historical view, not just looking at what's happened in the last 50 years, but what's happened in the last 10 to 50,000 years as humans have removed the megafauna, we've caused defaunation across the earth. As we've tilled up the soils and removed forests, we've transformed the whole biosphere in a way that is essentially irreversible and permanent. So, interestingly enough, maybe one of the most powerful changes that occurred before we even have essentially agriculture is the extinctions of megafauna on most continents. With the early modern, behaviorally modern humans arriving on continents, we see the disappearance of the megafauna. And from an ecological point of view, this creates huge shifts in the structure of ecosystems as the top part of the ecosystem, or even just the big consumer of primary productivity in the ecosystem is removed. You see trees growing where they never grew before, and trees being lost in other areas. just huge changes in the way things are. And this is only, just by driving a few large species extinct. Okay, so this is a permanent effect. Other effects, of course, are maintained by us. When we remove forests and till the soils, the trees don't recover. So we see a loss of forests in many areas of the world. And the other really huge and will be measurable effect for the very long term is our mixing up of communities by bringing new species in. Not just by driving species extinct do we change the communities. We're bringing new species in, and their interactions create novel communities, novel ecosystems that essentially resemble anything that could be created without us. So I will tell you what I consider to be the generally accepted definition of folks in the community, including me, who work with novel ecosystems. The formally accepted definition is an ecosystem that has been pushed so far away from its, quote, reference natural state by either changing the abiotic environment or by changing the biotic community to a point where it effectively cannot be pushed back to the reference state. If it cannot be pushed back, then it's a novel ecosystem. That is an excellent question. And as somebody who studies, I also look at the paleohistory of human transformation of ecosystems. That's something I've published on and something I'm working on right now. So when we're looking at the question of a reference state, the classic answer of ecology is the, quote, natural state, some kind of state of an ecosystem or community that existed prior to substantial human disturbance. Now, in a lot of areas of the world, and probably most of Europe is in this category, everything since the last glaciers receded has been influenced by people substantially. And that makes the reference state of this kind of pre-existing natural state not viable, and you have to argue for some reference state to be chosen by whoever wants to define it, perhaps governance, perhaps a community, would have to decide at what stage of the community or ecosystem's development is considered the reference, so perhaps the desirable state. But is this something that can always be assessed objectively just by making measurements? And I think at this point, it's more or less a decision. Excellent question again. So from the point of view of what is the meaning of wild? So I think in the Anthropocene, the meaning of wild, I think, comes to mean without human control, not without human influence, because there's no such thing as without human influence, but there could be no intentional human intervention, or the decision to limit that intervention as much as possible. And with rewilding, it's really, the full term is Pleistocene rewilding. So the goal is to reintroduce these mega carnivores, mega herbivores that were lost in the late Pleistocene, bring them back, perhaps not the same species, but species with the same functional niche. They're still able to serve that ecological function, to bring them in and essentially let them restructure the ecosystem in a way that might be analogous to the Pleistocene state. And that's of interest for a variety of reasons, especially for anyone who's been to Africa and seen some of the places where, even though humans come from Africa and we have a deep history there, you still see the megafauna there. And for most people who study the ecology there, the ecologies of the places without the megafauna are depauperate. They're very simplified compared to the ones that you have in a place with these megafauna. So there's a desire, especially among ecologists who are interested in these complex states, to try to reestablish them, because I think they resemble something more desirable in this wild idea. But I think you'd have to argue that if you introduce, especially a species that's not native, into an ecosystem, you're going to create a novel ecosystem. It's just, how could you not? I mean, that's what's going to happen. I think the concept of health is a very useful concept for understanding organisms, right? Because organisms live and die. Ecosystems only change. And the idea that health can be defined for a system that must change. Ecosystems must change. And in fact, we're going to see one of the greatest changes of all is going to be the changes that ecosystems have to make to deal with climate change. And the idea that you would keep them in some particular state that you could define as the healthy state is going to be essentially impossible when the ecosystems have to change so much. It makes a lot of sense when things have to stay the same, but when things have to change, I don't believe the concept of ecosystem health is a useful concept for ecosystem management. Well, I think ecosystem resilience, if it's treated as a scientific problem, not as a kind of maybe a conceptual problem, is something that you can measure, because it's about essentially the ability of a system, some variables of a system, to come back to their original state when disturbed. And I think because it's a measurable thing, at least in systems that you can observe change, that's a problem with some systems where you only have one system, like the Earth. There's only one. So we can't look at it going back and forth for these changes. But if you, like for example, with lakes you can look at how capable a lake ecosystem is of bouncing back from, say, excess fertilizer going into it, and how long it takes to reestablish the same pattern as before. So under those conditions, I think it's a definable quantity, and it has I think more utility from the point of view of scientific ecosystem management. An excellent point, and I think that it is important to manage change rather than to manage stability. And resilience is partly about systems that are capable of remaining stable in the face of perturbation. So I think that is a more forward-looking ecosystem management plan. I think that resilience is something that we can work with practically. If we need to, we can make the measurements and work with it. But I think the more forward-looking, sustainable practice is to look at where our ecosystems need to be in 50 years and try to get them there. And that's a big open question, because any particular place may have to become more like another place, not like more like maintaining itself. And so this challenge is a pretty great one. We can't just look at one site in order to manage the ecology of a region. You have to look at how the whole trajectory is going to play out in the future as best as you can. So managing change is a better strategy than trying to make systems that are resilient and can retain the same state, because we know that they can't in the face of the kind of changes that they're going to face in the next 50 to 100 years. So for me, and I have to say that I am not a professional ecosystem manager, I'm a scientist, and I don't work with ecosystem managers all that often, except farmers occasionally. But from my point of view, the most important thing is to get straight what the community of interest is. So who is going to determine whether the change that we observe is good or bad, so that you have actual people in the process that could help guide you toward a decision process about what to do. Because the decision process is going to be the most important thing. You're going to have to make decisions. And some of these decisions are probably going to be hard decisions that involve wicked problems, right? Where two groups will never be equally satisfied with your decision. And so you'll have to negotiate constantly over this period of change, right? So that it doesn't involve one intervention. It involves a process of continued intervention. So I'd say that's probably the most important thing about managing change, is to have a process for negotiating with everyone involved. But once that's done, I think visualizing, this is where science can come in the best, being able to visualize the potential scenarios through which change could occur, and to try to negotiate through that community of stakeholders, those able to make these decisions about preferred outcomes, to come up with strategies. And then, again, considering this as a perpetual process, right? It's not going to end. It's not a 10-year process. It's a continuous, perpetual process, what we call adaptive management, where you're continuously coming up with what you think is happening, trying to manage toward the better outcome, evaluating how those outcomes are turning out, and maybe changing your plan. And so it's a continuous cycle of planning and observing and then deciding, in a sense. So it's to establish a process. And there are some structural things I think we can do. So we know that north-south movements are going to be, or sorry, south-north movements, north-south in the southern hemisphere. These movements are going to be very important to species. They're all going to have to move. And so facilitating that movement through structural change, for example, making it possible for species to move through highways. It's a great example. Or through farmland areas, making sure there is a conduit through which species can move in these directions toward the poles is a simple structural long-term plan that's got to be put in place as well. The good thing is I think there's a lot of people already studying this, and so the process has already begun. And the other good thing is that it's a slow process. Global climate change, no matter, it's fast compared to its native natural state, but it's not fast compared to human change. So we do have 50 years to accomplish what needs to be done in 50 years. I think that actually it's an easy question in some ways. What does conservation mean? Okay, I would argue that conservation is a land use, just like any other land use. There's decisions and objectives. We want to have a place that we can call nature, perhaps. That might be the objective. And what does it take to have that place? So with conservation, you're taking a place where you feel already meets that criteria. This is a place that we want to be like this. And so you just try to keep it the same as much as you can. With restoration, you have maybe some vision of where the place should be like. And you work together to create that land use, the land use that might represent a past state of the ecosystem. I think in many cases those past perceptions, those reference states that we try to create are not much different than any other kind of imagining and designing of things. We're not really getting back to history. We're really just getting our version of it. But I think it serves real functions. It's really important, I think, to societies these days to have a feeling that we're bringing back some of the good old things that we lost. And restoration is a land use that does this. It means that the processes that were there since the beginning of life are still here and active, and species are able to adapt by evolution to some of the changes that we're implementing. Now, most species are only able to adapt to environmental change by evolution of their genetics, and that occurs as fast as generation time. It's relatively slow for most species. Depends on the species, but it's relatively slow compared to, say, climate change, or even much slower than deforestation. So for some species, it's a showstopper. The evolutionary process is extinction, essentially, which is an evolutionary process. For others, it is adaptation. The big challenge, I think, is that when we induce changes that are too quick for biological evolution to sustain a species in the face of these changes, and we cause extinction, I think that's an unfortunate outcome. And this is a feeling. I don't think scientifically you can make an absolute case that every species is necessary. But from a personal place, I feel like every species has a right to continue, even though it's a silly idea, really, because, right, the dinosaurs, do we still want them, et cetera, right? There's been a lot of extinction, and it's been the way of the planet has been to have species come and go. So to keep them is a personal, kind of a human want, almost. But I think the good thing is that evolution does continue, and it will enable life as it has before to encounter all sorts of massive changes to the Earth system and to continue on. So yes, I think it's a good thing that evolution continues, and I don't think I think if we could actually stop it, that would be a really remarkable thing. I don't think we're capable of that, maybe even 100 years from now. So geoengineering, so there is that statement that we've been geoengineering the planet. And from my point of view, engineering is in the kind of, ecologists have co-opted this term into ecology to mean something a little different than what it means in society. In ecology, to say that a species is an ecosystem engineer, like the beaver, is just to say that a species modifies the environment in some way that is not just based on their feeding and et cetera. It's actually physical modification for some, typically for some benefit. But from the point of view of society, I think that engineering means there's a purpose function attached to the action. So we are trying to gain something by engineering. So I do not think we have engineered the planet, ever. We've never actually said we want a different planet. We may want a different landscape where it produces food instead of trees and wildlife. So that's a form of engineering that we have engaged in, and we have transformed the planet, doing this one little bit at a time. No one ever decided to create a planet that's 40% agriculture. This just emerged. But to take a planet and say, we want the climate to change in this way, the whole Earth's climate, which everyone experiences equally, more or less. I shouldn't say that, but it's more equal than what I do in my field here, right? We're going to change the whole Earth system that way. I think that is novel. I think that is a novel proposal. I also think that when you consider why we would make such a decision, it would be essentially because we had failed at another thing, which is controlling the source of the problem in itself. And I'm not going to speak for the generation 50 years from now that is facing environmental conditions that may be extremely serious, extremely deadly, the kinds of things that would necessitate desperate decisions. But I consider geoengineering as a desperate decision of desperate people who have failed at doing what we should do in the first place, which is avoid this thing that we know is coming. So again, I think it's a desperate measure, and I don't think it has great precedent. And I think it's extremely risky. But I think, on the other hand, I think in a sense, like I said, I'm not going to speak for people 50 years from now that it's not going to be the best decision. It's quite a possibility. We're not there yet. And the idea that we would avoid consideration of this because of the fact that, like I said, it is a failed solution already, just to talk about it, is also foolish. We should, if in 50 years this needs to happen for societal reasons, we've decided it needs to happen, we should be prepared by having studied it. So I'm all for studying geoengineering and considering it and continuing the discussion and the research. But again, I think it's the last thing that we want to do. Well, the truth is that we don't know of life on other planets yet, even though the theoretical potential for this and the statistical potential for this seem very high. We have no knowledge of these places, only theory. So it is a unique thing for us to have life on Earth, that's for sure. And it's certainly not typical of most planets. Most planets do not have life. And a living planet is a very different planet than a planet without life. It's a whole nother level of process that doesn't exist on all these other planets. And I would argue actually that the human system that is emerging now is also a whole nother level that didn't exist before us. But anyway, getting back to biosphere, yes, I consider the concept of biosphere very, very useful. It's the simplest way to describe life on Earth in some ways. You just say the biosphere. What is life on Earth? It's the biosphere. It's all this emergent life interacting together and sustained over very long periods of time, right? Billions of years. Gaia is a hypothesis for, it's for many things. It's not as simple as just looking at how the Earth functions, or the idea that it might be kind of almost a sentient being of itself trying to kind of maintain itself, but the idea that there are, in a sense, natural processes that create the conditions for life to exist are the same ones that bring life into existence. So you basically, the idea that life kind of controls the conditions for life, it's kind of a snowballing kind of process, it maintains itself, is attractive. You could argue one hypothesis is you could take some life and move it to another planet, and it would be able to change that planet and create life there, which is, of course, completely unknown, complete speculation, maybe has no relevance, but it's an interesting prospect, the idea that, kind of life can create itself and sustain itself. Some people call the Anthropocene the age of man. And I don't call the Anthropocene the age of man. I think that doesn't really mean anything. And I think it does produce this idea that somehow man has become the cause célèbre or something. And I don't think anything has changed in that way. Humans are having a transformative effect on the whole Earth. We are driving the Earth in directions it could never go without the powers that have been gained, not by individuals, not by humans, but by our societies interacting at scales beyond our control. We see processes emerging that are changing the Earth. But where that places man, I'm not sure. I don't think we're any more in control of human society than we ever were. And so it's not convincing to me that we have taken control of a planet. We are definitely changing the whole planet, and we have the potential, should we be able to, when I say we, I mean literally enough people to decide anything globally that could actually act globally, whatever that is, to actually change the course of the whole Earth system. And I think it's been easy to do to stop a few things we were doing, but to actually change the net trajectory, which is increasing human transformation. That's not something I'm clear that the humans are capable of doing that at this point. So this is the idea that, like you mentioned earlier, this idea of nature's economy, that we could essentially integrate the natural processes of ecosystems into the economy in a way that they have economic value. Well, simply put, I think we've already done that. And that's why we have agriculture that has transformed things. You talked about the idea of simplifying as being something political and also economic, that's a good thing. And it's actually a good thing for anyone trying to produce commodities. Why would you try to produce food out of a forest when you can cut it down and replace it with a food-producing species? And there's a tendency, I think, if you need trees, you're going to want a forest, but why do you want this old-growth forest that is very slow to grow when you can plant a fast-growing species that will produce a lot more? So when you bring economics together with ecology, you get engineered ecosystems like agriculture, plantations, aquaculture. That's what you get. And it works quite well for human production. But I don't think it works quite well for natural ecosystems to be integrated into the economy, because there is this, if you want to produce this amount of this service, you can always produce it better by engineering a bit. And once you do that, if you want to just produce more, right, more carbon sequestration, cut down that old forest and put in the new fast-growing forest. Okay, and that's not conservation. Where I think it can work, and it does work, and in reality it's the only way it's really used, is not in the marketplace, in the realm of conservation alone, where you're just talking about, we want a plan here that is going to conserve something. We've already decided that, not the market. Then you can start using the pricing to help you manage the details and the transactions involved in conservation. But the idea that somehow, if we put nature fully into the market, that the market would help us conserve, I don't believe this. The market itself is a mechanism of efficiency in production, and it would change ecosystems immediately if all ecosystems in the world and all were producing natural services for the market. But simply put, one of the simplest paradigms of ecology is that when you have system-level interactions, when everything's connected, it's one of the simplest messages of ecology, complexity it creates unpredictability. So the idea that if you change one part, you can achieve changes in all the other parts perhaps, and some of them unpredictable, is normative in ecology. And so there are some levels, there are some predictable elements. We do know some things that generally happen. You add fertilizer, you will transform an ecosystem towards certain tendencies. We can see some general mechanisms, but we also have we're looking systematically at everything. And so instead of just looking at one thing at a time, simple interactions, we're looking at more complex interactions. And for that reason, I think any practicing ecologist is going to say, we can't be sure of the result if a system is perturbed, sometimes even a little bit. It's not so simple and predictable, I think, as physics, that's for sure. Yeah, so I don't think you can get away with either practice. And history helps us to look at some of the changes that have happened that were unexplained. There's lots of classic examples of this. In fact, when you teach ecology, some of the classic examples that we use are histories of failure in ecosystem management. Typically, management of one thing to produce a positive result produces very negative effects elsewhere in the ecosystem that need to be changed back or changed in some other way. So it's a normative lesson of ecology that you simplify too much, you take risks. The other thing I would say though, it connects to the other question about ecosystem services. If you are trying to produce efficiently, we do know that simplifying ecosystems can do that. Efficiency is gained. You lose complexity that way and things become more predictable, but it's perhaps not what you want. You don't go to the nature park to see one species. It's not really what you go for. You like to see the interactions. You like to see the more natural processes. So the engineered system of turf grass isn't satisfying enough for us, and it certainly wouldn't be the Earth that I think anyone wants to live in. As an ecologist, I see the future as a very challenging place where a lot of the comforts of the ecosystems of the past are essentially going to be gone. You won't be able to assume in the future that the ecologies of your childhood would be something to expect in your adulthood in the future. And I think that's something that is hard for us to deal with, because I think what we grow up with is something that we take to be the better thing, the thing that we value, and something changed from it as being worse, usually, at least from the point of view of nature. Maybe we like our technology to get better, but with nature we like it kind of to be the way it is. And so that's going to be something we're going to have to take on, because in order for processes really to continue as they have, we have to experience a lot of ecological change. And so I think there's a human process. We have to, in a sense, let go of the stability that we've had and embrace the idea that we need to help ecology change. It's our fault. We did this change. We didn't really want it, but we are going to have to work with it in a way, I hope, that we will feel better about in the end. That we will come to this period where we have really just emerged to an understanding of the fact that we are changing everything, and that we can do something about it. In theory, we can actually change the way we change the Earth. I'm convinced that at some point we will start to act on that. When I say we, I mean the systems that are capable of actually implementing change at the scale of the globe. I think these things will start to play out in the longer term, and that we will, just like with the environmental pollution we created in the beginning of industry that was extremely toxic and extremely undesirable, but was tolerated for a long time, will become intolerable, and societies will embrace the idea that these things must be regulated. It's intolerable to have polluted environments with people living in them. We'll feel the same way about what we're doing to the entire planet, and that we will do better in the long term. But it's going to be a very slow transition to getting to that point, and so in the meantime, we're going to go through a period of, I think, unprecedented environmental ecological change that it's going to really have to change the way we think about ecology.
Thank you very much.